to talk a little bit about canned salmon and actually the history of canned seafood in general. I found quite a few articles that delve into this topic, and I thought it would be nice to include it with this recipe. This is such a simple recipe, and it caused me to wonder why canned salmon specifically was used in a book where everything else is cooked fresh for the most part. There had to be something there, so I did a little research, and I'm going to link the main article I am speaking from below if you want to read more about this. I find it quite an interesting read. A number of individuals contributed to the early development of the canning industry. Although national pride, with its consequent tendency to bias, often places varying emphasis on the importance of these contributions. It's generally agreed that the original inventor of the art of canning was Nicolas Appert, a Frenchman, and that the basic methods of the industry are the result of his work. In 1795, the revolutionary French government was at war on land and sea with most of the other European governments in areas as widely separated as the West and East Indies. Few ports were open to the French, who therefore had to depend largely on dried, smoked, and pickled foods brought from France. These products were subject to spoilage, and their use resulted in the widespread incidence of deficiency diseases, such as scurvy, which greatly weakened the military forces. The French government, therefore, offered a prize of 12,000 francs to anyone who would develop a new method of preserving food so that the decomposition would be reduced and more of the original characteristics of fresh food retained. The article points out that Nicolas Appert, a confectioner, brewer, distiller, and wholesale caterer, was interested in this problem, and the story of his efforts at a solution is well worth reading. Canning was first developed on an extensive commercial scale in the United States, and most of our pioneer canners were primarily packers of fish and seafoods, packing fruits, vegetables, and preserves as the secondary or incidental items. Strangely enough, the packing of fishery products presents more difficulties than processing other types of foods. Canning is said to have been introduced into the United States by Ezra Daggett and Thomas Kensett in 1819 when they packed oysters and other seafoods in New York. It is understood these men learned the art in England before immigrating to this country. Now let's talk salmon specifically. It is said to have been canned as early as 1877 in northern Japan, but commercial operations date from 1890 in that area. The salmon canning industry was established in Siberia about 1906. And while Alaska is today the most important salmon canning area, its first cannery was not built until 1878 at Klawock on Prince of Wales Island. In fact, the salmon I'm using today in the recipe is from there. So this book was published in 1897. And this was about the time salmon had become widely available to the consumer in the supermarkets, and recipes using it were popping up in cookbooks all over. So that's why it's in this book. There was a demand for it. So here's my can of salmon from Alaska. And the recipe does say to use a mortar and pestle. I use that for breaking up spices. I don't want to put anything wet in there. So I am using the modern day mortar and pestle, which is the mini food processor. And I add in all of the ingredients. So it would be the parsley, the cut up shallot, and it does call for watercress. You'll see in the recipe linked below, and none of my stores have watercress in stock. So I used the next best thing, which is peppery arugula. And instead of whole anchovies, I'm using my trusty anchovy paste. Gives a nice depth of flavor. Some capers. And about 2 tablespoons of cooked spinach. It will have a link below to my trusty Cuisinart. It has other attachments and I use it several times a week. Not daily, but definitely 3 or 4 times a week. I just get that all chopped up into a paste. It comes together fairly quickly. There's no oil in this, but I think some olive oil, just a bit, would be nice. But I'm following the recipe. And it can take a little more spinach, so I'm going to add it in. And it's done. This will add some brightness and depth of flavor to the salmon. Now it says to drain the salmon and break it up into flakes. And if you haven't had canned salmon before, it's a whole piece of fish that's folded in on itself. So there's bones and skin in there, but they come out pretty easily. And I'm doing it with a paper towel. I don't know if you can tell under my little mini board. I use a mini board on top of my main cutting board when it's a small project. I'm just looking for bones, taking off the skin. You could leave the skin on, but it's prettier with it removed. Just checking to make sure I didn't miss any bones. I recall seeing a show, I don't know how long ago. It was probably on the Food Network, and they were in Spain, and there's some really nice tapas that are served from canned seafood, just gorgeous oil-cured seafood. So there's no shame in canned food. Of course, some of it's better quality than others, and it's nice to have any canned food when you are having lack of power or another compromised situation that you don't have access to fresh food. All right, so the next step, she says, moisten the salmon with the Ravigote put into mayonnaise. So it's seasoning the mayonnaise. Doesn't say how much, so I'm checking proportion, and I'm going to check for flavor and see how the balance is. It needs a little bit of salt and pepper. And a little more brightness from that green sauce. And I'll add the salmon in thirds, just to make sure I have the right proportion of the sauce to the salmon. And I've left the salmon fairly chunky because I know it's going to break up some more when I toss it in the mixture. It looks like I made enough for the whole can. And I feel the salmon as I add it, just to make sure there's no bones. No one wants to bite into a bone, and sometimes they can, slip through the cracks, so to speak. And the recipe says to serve it over a bed of greens and mask with mayonnaise. And I'm not going to get out the pastry brush and paint over with mayonnaise. Instead, I'm going to do the modern way, which is the squeeze bottle. Now I've thinned it out with a little bit of milk, and it's ready. The salmon salad is delicious. This is another terrific recipe in this book. It absolutely elevates the flavor of canned salmon. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you again.